For years, Beijing had been playing a slow, suffocating game, tightening its grip around Taiwan, muscling through the East China Sea, and daring anyone in the region to push back. China had convinced itself, through sheer military intimidation, endless harassment operations, and the deployment of massive naval fleets, that it had permanently redrawn the rules of the Pacific in its own favor. The surrounding waters were, in Beijing's calculation, already won, already controlled, already beyond challenge. But then, on the morning of April 17, 2026, something happened that no war planner inside China's massive command rooms had dared to put on the map as a real possibility. For the very first time, a Japanese warship sailed directly through the Taiwan Strait, and it did not ask Beijing for permission. The ship was the JS Ikazuchi, an Ikazuchi-class destroyer of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, and it entered those contested, heavily monitored waters at exactly 4:02 in the morning, slicing southward through the pitch-black strait in near total silence. This was not an accident. This was not a navigational detour. This was a deliberate, calculated, and extraordinarily bold act of strategic messaging from Tokyo, delivered directly into the heart of the waters that Beijing treats as its own private lake. What makes the timing of this passage almost impossible to ignore is the fact that it came precisely 48 hours after something else, equally significant, had just happened in those same southern waters. On April 15, 2026, the Russian Pacific Fleet's corvettes Soversheny and Rezki, along with their supply tanker Pechenga, had sailed into the Chinese port of Zhanjiang in Guangdong province for a 5-day friendly visit. Russian and Chinese naval officers stood side by side on those docks, exchanging salutes, boarding each other's ships, and sending the clearest possible signal to the entire Pacific region that Moscow and Beijing were shoulder to shoulder, unified and unafraid. And then, 48 hours later, a Japanese destroyer tore straight through the Taiwan Strait. Before we go any further, if you are watching this and you're not yet subscribed to Backdoor Economics, this is your moment. Hit that subscribe button right now. You have exactly 10 seconds. Because the story of what Japan just did, and what it actually means for the balance of power across the entire Pacific, is exactly the kind of analysis that Backdoor Economics exists to give you. Verified, deep, and unfiltered. The JS Ikazuchi did not rush through those waters. It did not sprint past and disappear. According to the PLA Eastern Theater Command's own official records, the destroyer transited the strait from 4:02 in the morning all the way until 5:50 in the evening, a total of nearly 14 hours of deliberate, unhurried passage through waters that China claims absolute authority over. For 14 hours, a Japanese warship cruised directly through the most politically sensitive maritime corridor in Asia, with its systems active, its course undeviating, and its presence impossible to ignore or deny. China's response was exactly what the world now expects from a power that has built its entire regional reputation on projection and intimidation, rather than actual warfighting readiness. The PLA Eastern Theater Command deployed naval and air assets to shadow the JS Ikazuchi every mile of the way. Radar systems were locked on. PLA aircraft were scrambled overhead. Warning communications crackled through the radio lines. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun stood in front of cameras and called the transit a deliberate provocation, accusing Tokyo of flexing military muscle and sending wrong signals to what Beijing calls Taiwan independence forces. China's Ministry of National Defense lodged a formal protest, demanding Japan return to what it called the right path. But here is the critical thing that every single person watching this needs to understand clearly. China did not physically stop that ship, not once. Not a single warning shot was fired. Not a single vessel moved to physically block or divert the Ikazuchi's course. After years of constructing an image of absolute dominance over these waters, Beijing watched from a distance while Japan sailed straight through. The date Japan chose for this passage was not random, and Beijing knows it. April 17th is the anniversary of the signing of the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki, the deeply humiliating agreement that forced China's Qing dynasty to cede Taiwan to Japanese colonial control. Chinese state media erupted over this symbolism, calling the timing deliberate and provocative, accusing Tokyo of choosing the date to maximize the psychological impact on the Chinese people. Whether or not the anniversary was intentional, the effect was devastatingly precise. Japan had just made Beijing feel the full weight of history in its own waters. To understand why Japan moved with such boldness, you have to understand the geography that Beijing fears more than any weapon system in the world. Japan sits directly across what Chinese military doctrine calls the first island chain, the string of islands stretching from southern Japan through the Ryukyu archipelago and down to Taiwan that acts as a natural barrier between China's navy and the open Pacific Ocean. As long as Japan controls those islands and the narrow straits between them, China's massive fleet of warships and submarines cannot reach the deep Pacific without passing through choke points that Japan can monitor, contest, and in a conflict scenario, seal shut. This geographical reality is Beijing's permanent strategic nightmare, and it drives nearly every aggressive action China takes in the East China Sea and around the disputed Senkaku Islands. And Japan has been watching those actions escalate month after month. In March 2026, 4 heavily armed Chinese Coast Guard vessels entered Japanese territorial waters just 12 nautical miles off the Senkaku island of Minamikojima and conducted patrols for 3 straight days, testing Tokyo's patience and resolve in the most direct way possible. Japan did not simply issue radio warnings this time. The Japanese Coast Guard deployed immediately in full force. Patrol aircraft flew directly overhead, and the Chinese vessels were tracked step by step until they ultimately backed down and withdrew. That confrontation was not an isolated provocation. It was part of a pattern that had been building for months. Earlier in February 2026, a Chinese fishing fleet of more than 20 vessels, what Tokyo recognized as a maritime militia operation disguised in civilian clothing, penetrated Japan's exclusive economic zone and maneuvered to encircle the Senkaku area. Japan responded by scrambling military helicopters and deploying fully equipped patrol vessels with water cannons directly to the scene. The Chinese fleet scattered. And going back to January 2026, China had used a massive line of maritime militia boats to construct what amounted to a floating military barricade in the open ocean. A rehearsal, analysts believe, for the kind of blockade that could one day isolate both Taiwan and Japan's southwestern island chain simultaneously. Japan has been watching all of this, processing all of this, and building toward a response that would be unmistakable in its message and unmistakable in its implications. That response is the JS Ikazuchi sailing through the Taiwan Strait while Russian corvettes are still docked and celebrating in a Chinese port. The timing was not coincidence. It was a message sent to 2 capitals at once. To Beijing, it said that Japan will no longer accept the fiction that the Taiwan Strait belongs to China. To Moscow, it said that the spectacle of Russian and Chinese sailors toasting each other in Zhangjiang does not intimidate Tokyo, not even slightly. The roar of the Ikazuchi's engines through those narrow waters landed in both command rooms like a thunderclap, and the message required absolutely no diplomatic translation. Japan's ability to deliver that message is rooted in a military transformation that has been building quietly for years and is now producing results that are reshaping the entire balance of power in the Pacific. Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi took office and immediately made Japan's position clear, stating that any Chinese military action against Taiwan would constitute an existential threat to Japan, becoming the first sitting Japanese prime minister to directly and explicitly link a Taiwan conflict to Japan's right of collective self-defense. That statement triggered enormous anger in Beijing and equally enormous debate inside Japan, but it also signaled to the region and to Washington that Tokyo was done with strategic ambiguity. Japan's defense budget for fiscal year 2026 exceeded 9 trillion yen, approximately $58 billion, the 4th consecutive year of major spending increases, as Tokyo accelerates toward its target of doubling annual defense expenditure to 2% of GDP. The money is being spent on exactly the kinds of capabilities that keep Beijing awake at night. The helicopter carriers, JS Izumo and JS Kaga, have been transformed into light aircraft carriers, fitted with heat-resistant flight decks capable of operating F-35B stealth fighters that can take off and land vertically, giving Japan mobile air bases that can project power across the entire first island chain. Japan's maritime self-defense force now operates more than 48 state-of-the-art destroyers, many of them equipped with the Aegis combat system capable of tracking and engaging hundreds of simultaneous targets. Type 12 anti-ship missiles, upgraded with a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers, and American-made Tomahawk cruise missiles integrated into Japan's destroyer fleet mean that Tokyo can now strike enemy naval assets deep across the Pacific without a single vessel leaving port. And beneath the surface, Japan's fleet of ultra-quiet lithium-ion battery submarines, the Soryu and Taige classes, prowl the exact choke points that China's navy must pass through to reach the open ocean, lying in silent ambush at the Miyako Strait and the Bashi Channel. This is not the Japan that issued diplomatic protest notes and retreated behind its pacifist constitution every time China sent fishing fleets into its waters or Coast Guard vessels into its territorial seas. That Japan is gone. The JS Ikazuchi made that point with more clarity and force than any press release or parliamentary statement ever could. 14 hours of calm, unhurried passage through the Taiwan Strait, while China watched, fumed, and ultimately did nothing, was the most consequential single naval action in the Western Pacific in years. The implications of this passage will ripple across the region for a long time to come. China will respond with escalation. That is already visible in the PLA Eastern Theater Command, sending its own vessel formation through the Miyako Strait into the Western Pacific in the days immediately following the Ikazuchi's transit, a deliberate countermove designed to signal that Beijing has not been deterred. But the fundamental calculation in the Pacific has shifted. Japan has demonstrated that it is no longer asking China's permission to exercise its rights in international waters, no longer treating Beijing's declarations of sovereignty over the strait as legitimate constraints on its naval operations, and no longer absorbing provocation after provocation without delivering hard, concrete responses that Beijing cannot simply dismiss. The old Pacific order, in which China and Russia could orchestrate joint shows of force, send militia fleets into neighboring waters, and conduct endless gray zone operations with the comfortable assumption that Japan would not escalate, is no longer the operating reality. Japan has stepped out of its post-war defensive crouch and into the role of an active, assertive, heavily armed maritime power that is willing to challenge both Beijing and Moscow simultaneously and directly. The waters of East Asia will not be growing calmer. The waves are only going to get higher. That is the full picture of what just happened in the Taiwan Strait, and why it is one of the most significant naval moves in Asia in a generation. This is Backdoor Economics, and this is exactly the kind of story we exist to break down for you. Beyond the headlines, beyond the propaganda from both sides, straight to what is actually happening on the water and what it means for the world. If this video gave you real insight, subscribe to Backdoor Economics right now so you never miss what comes next. Because in the Pacific right now, what comes next is coming fast.